In the Lannon piece on instructions that we read for Lesson 12, this week's lesson, Lannon briefly discusses the importance of testing documentation and instructions. So I want to spend a bit of time talking about testing and testing methods, but first I want to talk about brainstorming and prototyping. For most of the assignments for this class, we've jumped in head first. However, for most work that you'll do beyond this class, you're going to want to brainstorm, prototype, and test the materials that you're creating. These processes will hopefully support you in creating usable, useful, well-crafted, well-planned, and well-thought-out documents. So first I want to share some examples. If you jump into document design work head first, often you only see a piece of a project. It's maybe like looking through a straw. If we can back up and see the bigger picture, we see that there's a lot of work, development, prototyping, and planning underneath. So we can look at something like this, or we can see the bigger picture. Something like this, or again, a much bigger picture and the larger space in which different documents are going to be put to work. Again, a narrow view, or the bigger picture, a piece of a project, or a project at a larger scale. Along with seeing the bigger picture is seeing how a project is framed. And that can be best understood, I think, by thinking in terms of a larger project life cycle. This graphic, for instance, splits a large-scale project into two key parts, the development portion and the implementation portion. During development, we generate an idea, begin work, experiment with different applications, evaluate, and then move a portion of the project into production. During the implementation portion, we generate information and publicity. We implement our idea along with keeping a close eye on how it's being used, what sort of revenue, for instance, it's generating. Then we have project closure. During a meeting, a lot of activities happen, including status reports and team meetings, and a lot of documentation is generated, including meeting notes, action items, priority lists, calendars, and project timelines. I would argue that to successfully work on any project, you have to see the whole and be able to think about and concentrate on smaller parts. I think project timelines are an incredibly important part of project development. On most of the project teams I work on, one of the first things we'll do at the start of all our team meetings is open up our project timeline and then spend the first few minutes of the meeting with people sharing where they're at on their tasks, and we'll update our timeline together if need be. Here's an example project timeline. You can see it allows us to map tasks, identify who's leading which tasks, note the start and end dates of specific tasks, and more. Now you can build something like this in Excel or Word, but there are also tons of great applications and programs that are specifically created so that you can generate timelines like this. And here's another project timeline. Focus more on big ticket items than the fine-grained work we saw in the previous one. This one shows us the planned time allocated for a task and then the actual time it took. And we can see that the people working on this project have typically been ahead of schedule across their work to date on this calendar, including market research, specification definition, overall architecture, and other tasks. Along with the project life cycle and ways of mapping it are project development models. There's no one right way to map a project, and there's no one right model to use. But there are good models in general, which help us see how we can best start, develop, and nurture different types of projects. For instance, there's the waterfall model, which begins with project requirements, moves into design, then into implementation and verification, and then maintenance. There's a spiral model, which begins with developing objectives, identifying and resolving risks, developing and testing, and planning the next iteration. And there's an iterative model, where cross-planning and deploying activities like designing and developing happen, sometimes over and over again until refinement and deployment occurs. I personally think iterative models, and these are just examples, are often the more reasonable project development model. It's helpful to think of discrete pieces of a project or moments in a project life cycle, but in reality it's much more typical that some of these activities happen at the same time or happen several times during project work. So, with that background in mind, let's focus in on the key part of this video: brainstorming, prototyping, and testing. I recently delivered with two colleagues of mine a talk for the business school here at MSU. One of the slides we used is this one. We wanted people to think about and reflect about how they typically think of brainstorming. Because what we found is that too often a team leader or a boss will say, okay, let's brainstorm. And then everyone kind of stands or sits around awkwardly. We often suggest models for brainstorming, approaches that can help make brainstorming more effective. Walt Disney, for instance, had a threefold brainstorming approach. For any project that he was starting with Disney, or that someone at Disney was launching, he'd assign 3 roles: a dreamer, a realist, and a spoiler. So one person was in charge of imagining the most amazing concept possible, regardless of budgets or costs or time frames. Another person was in charge of offering some down-to-earth practicalities, adding some reason. And then one person was assigned to be the naysayer, to put forth all of the roadblocks that could possibly be imagined. Pixar uses a framework they call plussing. Within Pixar, you're not supposed to offer comments or challenges to an idea during brainstorming unless you can offer a plus or a way to build on and improve the idea. And I love this because I think so often during sessions we get loudmouth naysayers during the brainstorming, like, oh, that's not possible, that can't happen, no way. And Pixar recognizes that and says, all right, yeah, we have to offer naysayer commentary and point out the negatives, but everyone is expected to do so in a way that generates an idea or way to move forward. IDEO has 7 guidelines for the brainstorming that they do with their clients, which includes the need to defer judgment. So set aside your judgment, think broadly, encourage wild ideas, stay focused, and go for amount of ideas. Quantity of ideas rather than quality of ideas, at least during the brainstorming phase. With those approaches in mind, I want to share a few models for facilitating brainstorming. One is called card storming, where an initial group of people are invited to share ideas on index cards or sticky notes. The goal is to generate as many ideas as possible. And this sticky note area, you might set it up in your lounge area where you work, or the mail room, or someplace where people travel frequently. I've actually seen these set up in bathrooms because organizations have figured everyone's going to go in there. And you could leave it up for an hour, a day, a week. The goal is to generate as many ideas as possible, and then typically a smaller group of people, maybe the project team, goes through all these ideas and tries to create categories of ideas and ways to potentially move forward. Another model is to engage in charrettes, where people are identified from across the organization. I love these because you get so many different ideas. Typically with charrettes, you might have the janitors, the CEOs, the call center personnel, mid-level marketing managers, all at the table. People are given a task or an issue to discuss, given time to work, and then the group comes back for a large group discussion. Here in Lansing last October, the city facilitated a design charrette to get people talking about how we might improve one of the street corridors. Invited were representatives of local companies, people who worked at local nonprofits, people who lived in the area, people from beyond the area that were just interested in what was going on. Another model I recommend a lot to organizations I work with is the Starburst model. A specific issue or idea is raised, and then people jot notes about the why, who, what, how, where, and when of the idea. So it's a way of kind of facilitating the brainstorming process, focusing in on a specific aspect or issue before moving forward. Another method I use a lot, especially when I'm working with large groups of people brainstorming, is I call it tweeting it out. This works really well if you've got a big group of people and you want to make sure to include everyone. So you can do this in a technical way, set up a hashtag and have a Twitter feed running on a big screen. Or you do it the less technical way and just have people jot down and then share their ideas. The trick is that they have to limit themselves to 140 characters and that's it. So you can hear a bunch of ideas really quickly. One of the guys I work with prefers the method of catalytic questioning, where you begin with a problem or issue and then get people generating questions. And they have to generate questions related to the issue. Most groups that I've seen top out at about 25 or 30, they just get stuck. The trick is to have a good facilitator or moderator pushing people to keep thinking and keep asking questions. That giant list can then be honed down to a few key considerations. Brings us to prototyping, which I'm only going to talk about briefly. Prototyping is a process of coming up with an initial design specifically to test it. Prototyping happens in all sorts of different contexts. For instance, if you're working on a website, you might create a paper wireframe or a site map to sketch out ideas before you begin actually generating images and pages and specific content. Software engineers might create an initial interface for a program on paper before they even start coding. And the slide here shows the visual, functional, and content-related ways of prototyping. And here we can see a range of prototyping products, from low fidelity or really early on prototypes to medium fidelity prototypes to a high fidelity prototype for testing. There's no one right or wrong way to prototype. The most important thing to consider is the activity and the purpose itself. Prototyping helps us sketch out a design before we devote a lot of time, energy, and tools to producing a high-level, high-fidelity design. The goal is to identify or at least anticipate problems or issues early on in the development process. Finally, I want to talk about testing, and testing specifically for document design. The guiding practices of user testing come from a range of disciplines, including user-centered design, user experience design, information architecture, experience architecture, and document design. User-centered design is based on the principle that users come first, always, and users should be integrated across project development. With user-centered design, you don't just develop a product and then test it on users. You do what you can to get them integrated and included in the whole life cycle of the project. User experience design is based on the belief that the documents we create shape users' experiences, and also that users' past experiences, for instance, with similar or related documents, shape how they use a document. User experience design often shapes materials around beliefs and stories that users bring with them and focuses on things like signposting, cue providing, and more. Microsoft Windows, for instance, has a set of user experience design principles with big goals like small things matter, good or bad, with points that suggest to developers and designers how they might improve users' experiences with Windows products. Information architecture, and I love this expression, architecting information, is the conscious, deliberate building of the elements of a document. The way the metaphor works is that information has to be designed like a piece of architecture, like a building. You have to consider elements like scaffolding and where you're going to place objects in the space and more. And finally, as we've been exploring this semester, the best principles of document design should shape how something is created, attending to the best ways in which words and images can be integrated for a specific purpose, a particular audience, and a specific context. So all of these factors frame usability testing. Usability testing is crucial for figuring out things like whether or not users are able to complete a set of instructions or how long it takes them to do so. It helps us identify any issues or problems users might have with a document, and it helps us figure out if they've had a positive experience with the document we've created. Think about something as mundane as an interactive form. Say a PDF that's posted on a website that people need to fill out and then submit through the website. I'm assuming all of you guys have had a bad experience with a poorly designed form. And that might even just be a form that's posted online but isn't interactive, that we then have to print and then fill out and then scan and then submit, or a form that just isn't designed correctly. There isn't enough room for us to include our responses. Usability testing should help avoid those sorts of situations so that our document, any document, for instance this form, doesn't frustrate people but helps them get the work they need to do done. Usability testing requires a good prototype, a solid draft document that's ready for people's eyes to be on it. Then you have to have a method and plan for the usability testing, along with an approach for finding participants and analyzing your findings. One method for usability testing is to, for instance, give people a stack of cards and have people categorize the cards. This can be really helpful, for instance, if you're creating the index for a book or a table of contents for a book, or if you're creating the navigation for a website. You want to have a sense of where users are going to go to find what information. Here's an example of a really basic print card sorting test. An example of a digital card sorting test where users were asked to drag the white boxes in and under the categories represented by the blue boxes. Task analysis is another method of usability testing. Often this is done with one participant and one researcher. The researcher asks the person to perform a task, for instance, finding a certain product on a website, putting it in a shopping cart, and going through the whole checkout process. The researcher will watch and observe to try to find out how the user navigates the site or document, and if the user faces any challenges performing the task. Focus groups can be used to conduct usability testing, where a small group of people meet with a researcher who asks specific questions and sparks discussion about specific aspects of a document. And finally, surveys are a method of usability testing. Tasks like focus groups can provide specific, contextual, qualitative data. Surveys can provide broader, larger, more quantitative data. And with that, we've talked a bit about project life cycles and honed in on practices for effective brainstorming, prototyping, and user testing. I know this was a lot of material and offered fairly generally, but I hope you'll find that these techniques, approaches, and methods are flexible enough for you to try out in a range of different circumstances, working on different types of writing projects.